So, first off, I wanted to say thank you for agreeing to speak with me. I know that the scheduling has been a bit of a pain, and I really appreciate you still being willing to talk with me.
No problem. Happy to do it.
So, first off, I just wanted to say that I actually learned about you through the Dana Rivers trial. I found out about it through a RadFem group, and then of course you were like one of the first search results to come up, and I was like, wow, someone out here does care about this thing that apparently no other news source is covering. So how did you start with getting an interest in that case?
So I started learning about the threats that so-called gender identity poses to women and girls in 2014. And in 2015, I joined the radical feminist group Women's Liberation Front. And in 2016, I joined the board of Women's Liberation Front, also known as WOLF. So by the time this happened in November of 2016, I was already pretty tapped into the community and generally aware of a lot of the issues. And so I knew about it when it happened.
And I noticed that you've kept very good records of even the court case with updates of what's actually happening in the courtroom and everything. How do you feel about the outcome of the trial and how long it took to come to court?
Well, it's interesting. Some of the delays were a result of the fact that it was a triple homicide case. And by their very nature, cases of that level of seriousness take a very long time. So I wasn't that surprised at how long it took. And then starting in 2020, of course, with the pandemic, I know from unrelated work that I have done on criminal justice that jails all over the country were kind of slammed throughout 2020 in terms of the administration. So, for example, I know that jail administrations had a very hard time getting lawyers in and out of the jails to talk to their clients. And it was very difficult to get health professionals, forensic psychiatrists, for example, in and out of the jail because of social distancing requirements and because of vaccine requirements. And I also know that it's standard procedure in American jails, even today, to just lock down an entire facility when there's a positive COVID test. So some of the delays, I think, were really understandably due to just administrative problems that the jail encountered as a result of the pandemic. I wasn't too surprised at the delays. What I was really troubled by is that really reasonable job of covering the case between 2016 and 2018. But then in 2018, the media seemed to have gone totally silent about this case. And there were a lot of women, radical feminists and lesbians in particular, who were very curious about what was going on with it because they couldn't get any information about it in the media because the media wasn't talking about it. And because of my professional background in the criminal justice system, I know how to find information about cases online. It's not difficult for me to look up an inmate locator at a jail or a court docket or things of that nature. And so it wasn't very difficult for me to get in touch with the head prosecutor on the case. And so I did that. I just called the prosecutor's office and asked to talk to the prosecutor. And I spoke with him, and then it ended up getting changed to a different prosecutor. So at that point, I thought, okay, well, no one's reporting on this case. And so why don't I go ahead and do that? And then for the longest time, all that happened is I was getting automatic notifications from the victim advocate office within the district attorney's office. And they would just send out these automatic emails that just said, delayed for the medical report. It was delayed for months and months, just waiting for a medical report of a psychologist or psychiatrist who was going to be examining Rivers to consider Rivers' insanity claim and Rivers' claims about competence at the time of trial. So that took forever. And then finally, we got word that the trial was going to start in October, and it did. So that's sort of leading up to the trial. And then I didn't attend most of the trial, but there were a small group of women who did. They attended almost every day, or they at least tried to have one woman in the courtroom every day. There was no media, so it just fell to them. And these women are local women, they're not attorneys, and they just did their best to take notes as, you know, as carefully as they could, and they would send them to me and I would post them on my website. And then in November, a woman who lives nearby offered to fly me out to attend the closing arguments and the verdicts, which I did. So the only parts of the trial that I was actually present for were the closing arguments and the reading of the verdicts.
So something that I've noticed is there's not a lot of reporting on crimes by trans women in general. If you're looking for reporting on, for example, I'm sure you're aware of how they have trans women who are fully intact men in jails of other women, and the crimes that they commit in those jails are often not talked about, or they're painted in a flattering light. Like Pink News, for example, will mention, oh, trans woman in this jail was horribly victimized, and then completely neglect to talk about the women who he affected. Do you think that there's a sort of suppression of news reporting on people due to their gender identity?
Absolutely. And just to be clear, I don't use words like trans women or trans woman because the men that we're talking about aren't women.
Of course.
So I don't use that language. But yes, absolutely. I think, and I have spoken privately with reporters who agree with me, that most editors in mainstream media outlets will not will not report on any honest coverage of what some of these guys do to women and girls in prison and outside. And when they cover it, they most frequently refer to the perpetrator, who's a man, they'll refer to him as a woman. So not only is there a dearth of coverage, but when there is coverage, it's filled with lies about the sex of the perpetrator. It's really troubling.
So I worked at a rape shelter in my community for about a year as a crisis counselor. And during our training, we went over terminology. For example, you can't call, like if a woman does something to a boy, it's not considered rape because rape is with a penis specifically. And so I've noticed that there's a trend of, like, there's been a 300% increase in sex crimes committed by women because, you know, they're trans identified males who are being marked down as women. But when you look at the crime itself, it's impossible for a woman to rape somebody else under the law because the law classifies rape as being insertion with a penis, you know? It's just.
So that would depend on state law. So that's really interesting to me because as far as I know, most states in the US, like where I live in the District of Columbia, and DC law has changed its laws over time. And so today, any person, in theory, woman or man, can commit a rape or a sexual assault. And I know that in England, by definition, a rape is a crime that's only committed by a man because, as you say, it's perpetrated with the penis. And if the jurisdiction where you were in that rape crisis center still has a law in the books that says a rape is only a crime committed by a man, that's very interesting to me because I'm not aware of many jurisdictions in the US that do that, but that's really interesting.
I think it's mostly for the internal classification. I'm not into the law side of things. I was just there as emotional support. But the language has been interesting to me because I've noticed language is supposed to evolve naturally. You know, we create slang, we create new words out of necessity, out of use. But when it comes to gender ideology, there is a directed, targeted movement of how language is evolving. And, you know, like, for example, the way we define woman, you can no longer, like, a woman is an adult human female, obviously. And go back 5-10 years, no one was arguing otherwise. And now, you know, the Cambridge Dictionary is redefining woman to be inclusive, which in turn excludes women, because how are you supposed to define a group that is inherently exclusionary? And I'm just
Yeah,
interested, how do you think that's affected law, and especially with, like we said before, the suppression of, you know, media coverage on this kind of cases?
yeah, it's interesting, right? Like the way that language is being used. So our society today seems to be almost obsessed with the concept of inclusivity. But in theory, there's nothing wrong with exclusion in appropriate circumstances, right? Like, it's okay to exclude men from women's bathrooms. It ought to be, right? But we're so obsessed with this concept of inclusivity that we seem to have lost the plot. But I think you're totally right that this has happened very rapidly, where I think you're right, 5 years ago. Well, let's see, let's do the math. So in 2018, Kelly J. Keane in Liverpool in the UK put up a big sign that said woman is an adult human female, as you just said. And some guy, Dr. Adrian Harrop, campaigned to have that removed. So at least in 2018, people were starting to criticize women for claiming womanhood as our own. And I think it was happening before that. But since then, it has been happening with astonishing speed. And we're sort of socially precluded from claiming womanhood as an exclusively female status. And I think it's very dangerous. I think it's dangerous from a feminist perspective, which is where I come from, because I'm interested in liberating women and girls. I'm interested in the rights, privacy, and safety of women and girls. And for that purpose, I have to be able to say that women and girls are human females. And I think it's perfectly appropriate to exclude men and boys from spaces, sports, etc., that are intended to be reserved only for women and girls.
I also find it interesting that, I mean, I was in high school in 2015 when, you know, gay marriage was legalized. And I think like prior to that, I came out when I was like in 8th grade. I was really young. But we get to high school and I distinctly remember the beginning of I guess really the gender stuff we see today. Like I remember we had the gingerbread person thing in our gay straight alliance, which was renamed after like a year because that wasn't inclusive enough. And then I started to see, like, I remember distinctly, I like to wear button down shirts and casual men's clothes because they were comfortable. And I remember conversations with my classmates, with my peers, and they'd say, well, because you like wearing men's clothes, that means that you can't be a woman, right? And I've heard that discussion over and over again, particularly within trans spaces with young women who are uncomfortable with the sexualization of women in our current society. And instead of seeing that as society has an issue, I don't like being sexualized, and that the issue is society, they see it as the issue is me, I don't love my oppression, so therefore I'm not a woman. And I'm wondering, I feel like the change in language has really like gone along with that line of thought. For example, have you heard of Dylan Mulvaney, the Days of Girlhood? It's the depiction of women's oppression as a choice, as something that you can identify with over something that just is a part of our society as a patriarchy. I'm Go ahead.
No, yeah, of course I'm familiar with Dylan. And I just think that Dylan makes a complete mockery of womanhood and of girlhood for that matter. And I think for an adult man to pretend to be a girl is pretty disgusting, really. What is even more troubling from my perspective is that Dylan was invited by the President of the United States to have a conversation at the White House. And so for Dylan to do that, to do what he's doing, I think it is disgusting. But for the President of the United States to celebrate it is even more troubling.
And that's especially interesting because they recently mentioned how trans-identified males would still be included in the draft if there ever was one. But we still have to respect gender identity when it comes to bathrooms and changing rooms and athletics. So it seems like they're able to recognize when men are male when it suits them, but when it actively harms women, then it's something that can easily be overlooked.
Absolutely. I mean, part of what's so absurd about this entire societal conversation is that really at the end of the day, everyone knows what a woman is and everyone knows what a man is, including the United States government. As you know, the United States government has stated that all males are required to register for the draft at 18. And it doesn't have anything to do with identity. It doesn't have anything to do with wearing dresses. It doesn't have anything to do with wearing makeup. Everyone knows what a man is, and everyone knows what a woman is. we just seem to persist in this collective refusal to acknowledge reality.
And I'm on the younger side of things, obviously, so I wasn't there for any of the earlier, feminist movements or activism. But looking backwards, it seems like we've done a giant shift from 80s and 90s where it was, girls, guys can do whatever. You can play with dolls, you can play with trucks, your toys, your clothes don't define you, to where we are today, where it's gender is literally just clothes. So, I mean,
Yeah.
you've been involved in activism for feminism for quite a while. So, what do you think of that transition?
Yeah, so thanks for asking. I find myself in kind of an interesting place chronologically and with respect to feminism in that I was born in 1972. So I'm obviously considerably older than yourself and your peers, and I'm also considerably younger than the women who were very active in the second wave women's movement in the 60s, 70s, and going into the 80s. So I can sort of look behind me and see what they were doing and look in front of me and see what you all are doing. And I'm kind of right in the middle of that age wise. So I was a huge beneficiary of second wave feminism. And there was an album published, I want to say in 1972, may have been 73, called Free to Be You and Me. And it was making exactly the case that you're talking about. It was saying that girls can be girls and play with trucks and play in the dirt if they want to, and boys can be boys and wear dresses and play with dolls if they want to. And it was really groundbreaking. And so I grew up in that, right? Like I grew up as a girl and a huge beneficiary of the second wave feminists who came before me. And I did not feel particularly limited by the social expectations that come to women and girls. Obviously, in many cases, I did. We can talk about sexual harassment in my 20s and 30s. We can talk about various ways in which teachers and later bosses treated me as a female. But at least as far as my parents were concerned, when I was a young girl, I was not brought up to live within those kinds of constraints, the kinds of constraints that women older than me had had to break free of. And now today, we're going backwards because we're saying if you are a boy who likes to wear dresses and play with dolls, you're actually a girl. And if you're a girl who likes to play in the dirt and play with trucks, then you're actually a boy. It's almost in some ways even more regressive than the sex role stereotypes that society was facing before the second wave feminism came around and tried to break through all of that. So I just think it's really distressing the direction in which we're going. And, I hope we can get back there. I've heard a lot of second wave feminists who are maybe, 15 to 20 years older than me really lament that so many of the gains that were won in the 60s, 70s, and 80s are just gone now, in part because women thought that they had won. They thought that they won stuff. And so they just kind of stopped fighting for feminism. And now we're seeing the rollback of that, I would argue, across the political spectrum, right? There are some rollbacks of women's rights that are coming from the political right and some that are coming from the political left. I don't know if you want to get into that at all, but I see the dynamic.
Really interesting because there's a sort of political homelessness for radical feminists because the left is in this weird postmodernist stage where nothing is real. By saying something, you make your identity a real thing, which is so weird to me that we're all adults here and yet we're pretending that by stating I'm a millionaire that suddenly makes it true. And then of course on the right you have the rollback of Roe v. Wade. I know there was a court case recently, they tried to bring up birth control. I mean, you've even seen cases of women being unable to get medication for diseases they have, painful diseases, because it might possibly cause a miscarriage. And so you have political, homelessness, where as a radical feminist, I don't really agree with the left. I don't agree with the idea that women are an idea are a state of mind, and I don't agree with the right, who really only opposes trans issues because they dislike gender nonconformity, not for the harm it does to women and children.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that traditional Christian conservatives really like gender. They like gender roles. They like sex stereotypes. They want women in the kitchen. They would be quite happy if we went back there. And the political left these days is doing something which is actually not all that different, right? I mean, the political left would never say they want women back in the kitchen and in the home, but they will say that women don't deserve the right to single sex spaces. I mean, how crazy is that? Right? Like, a lot of people don't understand that even having public women's bathrooms was a feminist victory. Women had to fight for that. Back in the day, there were not women's rooms in public. There were only public restrooms, and women didn't feel comfortable using them because they didn't want to be in those spaces with men. And that's part of what kept women in the home. And so fighting for public women's rooms was a thing that feminists had to do, and it was a win. And now, the political left is saying we don't have the right to have that. The big irony of that is that you'll still see bodies at the international level. I mean, it's so interesting, right? Like, there are places in this world where there are no public women's restrooms. India, I think, has a lot of regions where there just aren't public women's restrooms, and women stay home as a result because they don't want to use public restrooms. And so the United Nations will argue that having public women's restrooms is important for the development of a region or a country. But here in the West, we're seeing the obliteration of public women's restrooms because men who claim to identify as women are allowed to use them under the law in most places.
And what really gets me is that this is being labeled as feminist action still, to have the men's bathroom and then the gender inclusive bathroom. In college spaces especially, there's this, I just see a distinct lack of real activism when it comes to so-called feminists today, because a lot of people will get bogged down with stuff like, we need more female superheroes, or I want deeper pockets, and I think we should be inclusionary of everyone, instead of actually doing something that makes a difference. We're bogged down in semantics and not really going anywhere.
So, I have not been in college for a very long time, but I do know that when I was in college in the early 1990s, we had a women's center in which I was active. We had a women's studies program. I didn't major in it, but I took plenty of courses in it where I learned a lot about the history of feminism. And at the Women's Center, we were very active in abortion rights. We did a lot of abortion clinic defense. You probably don't remember, but I don't know if you have any knowledge of back in the 80s, even though we had secured Roe v. Wade, anti-abortion conservatives would still attack abortion clinics and throw things and scream at and verbally and physically assault women who were seeking to access abortion clinics. And so one of the things that we had to do was form physical chains. And so we did this. We went to abortion clinics and we stood there arm in arm and protected the clinics and protected the women from anti-abortion conservatives who were trying to attack the clinics and the women. They stopped being allowed to do that under various laws that said they can't do that anymore. So that's good. But we were really active. We had Take Back the Night rallies that were designed to raise awareness about sexual assault of women and girls on college campuses. We had all this extraordinary feminist activism. And at some point by the late 1990s or early 2000s, I don't know exactly when, all the women's studies courses and all the women's centers on college campuses turned into gender centers and gender studies. And I think that played a big role in what you're talking about in terms of what's going on college campuses today.
It's something that was very aggravating to the point where I would switch to online college for the sake of, I just couldn't stand my peers when it came to these discussions. I remember one time I went on a date with a girl. We were on a mountain going hiking, and we get to the top of the mountain and she says, I think feminism is transphobic. And I'm sitting there at the top of this mountain going, oh God, I have to walk down this mountain with you for 2 hours while you tell me that you think women's rights, like working towards women's liberation, is transphobic? Okay. And when it comes to exclusion and inclusion, you don't see the same sort of pressure to force into other groups. It's just women. For example, there's at my old college, they had a I don't remember the exact name, but it was like a Black students group. And they had one for like Asian students or Muslim students or students who were, immigrants. And you didn't see people campaigning to be allowed into that when they weren't a part of that group. There seems to be an understanding when it comes to everything but women that if you have your scope too broad, then you're useless. If we cater to everyone, you cater to no one. But when it comes to womanhood, it seems like people see it as some kind of like exclusive club. And then I think part of that lies in how in the past 20 years, we've started to see a shift from, material feminism to this, I like, I want to dress in a sexually attractive way without being criticized for it. I want to make my own actions somehow fit the definition of feminism, even though they're not feminist.
Yeah, that's a frustrating one because I feel very strongly that a, a woman who's attacked by a man is not responsible because of what she wore. And also, we sort of get into questions about choosy feminism, right? So I choose to wear this outfit. And there are people who will argue that the choice to prostitute oneself, or I would say be prostituted, is a choice and is therefore empowering feminism. But it's so not. I mean, it just so isn't. And it becomes really clear when you say, well, if prostitution and pornography were empowering, you would see men and boys doing it all the time because men and boys like to do things that are empowering and they get to do them. But when women and girls want to do something that's empowering, we're told that, putting ourselves into situations where we're being sexually objectified is empowering. And it's such a lie. It's such a reversal, to use a feminist term, to gaslight women into thinking that these things are actually empowering. It's so not true. But I really do worry that a lot of women who are younger than me in your generation have been taught this lie that sexualizing ourselves is somehow empowering. I worry about it. I'm very happy to have been the age that I am, but I worry for women in their 20s and 30s today and younger.
I think it was last year, the Bimbo-fication trend really grew on TikTok. And the idea of choice feminism really was tied with that because, well, she chose to do it, so it's empowering. Except the issue is choices aren't made in a vacuum. We have to consider how society impacts that. Like, yes, maybe you want kids, but how much of that is because you inherently want kids versus growing up in a culture that positions motherhood as the pinnacle of being a woman? And the same thing kind of goes for a lot of things, to be honest. I feel like anytime you discuss anything from career choice to makeup use to what you're wearing, it all comes down to it's a choice, so it's fine. No need for critical thought, no need to consider how this may have been affected by other people. And then the left is really good at twisting language to make regressive ideas seem progressive, especially on social media. So with Bimbo-fication, I remember reading this one article that claimed that it was nihilistic feminism, where women realize they can never be free from their oppression, so they decide to embrace it. That is the opposite of feminism. That's an oxymoron. You cannot have a feminism where you're embracing your oppression. And yet, people are still trying to campaign for, porn is empowering, prostitution is empowering. And of course, they're always ignoring the voices of women who have experiences that go against that trend. For example, specifically with prostitution, a lot of women have done OnlyFans and done digital prostitution, digital sex work. And they talk over their experiences or as if they're more important than that of women who've been on the street, women in countries like Germany where they have the literal mega brothels. It's just
Yeah,
kind of, it feels like we're going in circles. In the 80s and 90s, previous feminists, Dworkin and everyone else is writing about how pornography is bad, and that was a pretty common stance. But now, because it's popular, we're gonna somehow force that into the feminist box.
yeah. And I think that media and advertising have made it worse. I think pop culture has gotten infinitely worse. I am often astonished when I look at images of music videos from the late 70s and early 80s when women didn't necessarily seem to feel obligated to hypersexualize themselves. Women seemed to be able to rely on their talent right? So female singers of the time were relying on their voice and the quality of their singing and the quality of their writing to get their message across and to perform and to have their careers in music, and did not seem to feel the need to present themselves in a manner that is hypersexualized. And we've just gone so far downhill since then.
It seems like womanhood is only acceptable when it's hypersexualized. No one is complaining about WAP, you know, the very explicit song, because it's talking about female sexualization. That's totally fine. But the minute that you mention, for example, a woman went to court past couple years because she was fired as a result of needing to breastfeed. And that was denied because men can breastfeed too. And so women is fine if that's because you're being sexualized and you're okay with it. But anytime that we have to have an actual discussion about rights, completely you can't talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very upsetting. You know, are you familiar with the legal case of Price Waterhouse?
I don't think so.
The only reason I bring it up is that it's a very interesting legal case where a woman named Ann Hopkins was working for the company Price Waterhouse. And by all accounts, she was a fabulous worker. She brought in all sorts of money for the company. You know, we can debate whether or not that's a good thing, or, you know, whether we think hypercapitalism is a good thing. But the point is just that she was very good at her job. And she was up for a promotion, and she was being considered for the promotion, and her promotion was delayed for a year. And when she was brought back up a year later for consideration, a lot of her male colleagues complained about her and said that she was too macho, that she needed to go to charm school, that she swore too much, that she was insufficiently feminine, that she didn't wear enough makeup, and she didn't wear enough jewelry, and she wasn't enough like a woman. And so she was looked over for the partnership, and she sued. This is all in the 1980s. And she sued, and the case eventually made its way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said to her, you know, you're right. You know, you're good at your job. You deserved that promotion. And the fact that you are insufficiently feminine to suit your male colleagues shouldn't matter. And so she won. And that's a massive victory. That was such a huge victory for women who choose not to conform to the stereotypes of femininity. But that was the late 1980s. And now, you know, we're back here where it seems like we're all supposed to conform to the stereotypes of femininity if we're going to be able to get ahead anywhere. It's very depressing. And I'm sorry about the world that my generation of women has left to you, because it's awful. The women who came before me did so much work and had so many victories. And the world that we're leaving to younger women is just devastating.
I think it's really interesting because I can see why some women thought we did it. Feminism won, we are equal society, it's great, and didn't think to look deeper for, you know, because on a surface level, it looked like, yeah, you did win. But it's the complacency that really allows these, you know, traditions to come back up. And what I find interesting is, for example, in 2015, you know, gay marriage is legalized. And that's when Stonewall shifted to include trans rights activism, because they didn't see another flashy big goal like that. To be honest, I don't think they expected to actually get gay marriage legalized across the US. And so they weren't prepared for what's your next step while you have all the steam. But going alongside gay acceptance has been this undercurrent of misogyny, of sexism, of, you know, patriarchal thinking that's been rising alongside it. And I think, you know, in 2016, we probably hit like a peak of acceptance for homosexuality. But you've also seen a lot of pushback because of how we've lumped in the LGB with the T, and the T's demands are often completely at odds with what homosexuals want. And, you know, as a result, it's kind of leading to this rise of patriarchal, traditional, misogynistic thought and homophobic thought in reaction to that supposed victory. Like, we thought we won something, but it's like a cycle. You win something and then there's a wave of pushback. And it's really interesting to me how gender ideology has been tied to both the rise of misogyny and the rise of homophobia in the past couple of years.
Yeah, so they're fundamentally different things, right? So when we're talking about LG and B, we're talking about attraction to other, right? Like most of us understand that when it comes to sexual orientation, the material reality of sex is actually important, right? Like lesbians are women attracted to women, gay men are men attracted to men, bisexuals are people of either sex who are attracted to people of either sex, straight people are members of one sex who are attracted to members of the T or Q is fundamentally different because it has to do with the self-identification. It has nothing to do with attraction to another. And so I really think that the attachment of the T to the LGB was really genius on their part. I think it was a really brilliant strategy. And I think it's just been devastating to our society as a whole. And, politically, I think that you're right that I think that acceptance of homosexuality has really grown throughout society, regardless of one's feelings about marriage, right? Like some people may still oppose same-sex marriage, but also not hate gay people and lesbians. But I think that this insistence on denying the material reality of sex is having a huge pushback politically, as you say, on both women and girls as a category, and on lesbians and gay men as a category.
For example, conservatives are not looking at, drag story hour with the kids and thinking this is a trans issue. They think of it as we're all as one lumped in group. And I don't know, this is very frustrating because even within the community, the addition of queer as being, anybody who feels othered is now able to opt into this marginalized community. And no other group can do this. You're not allowed to, as an oppressor, opt into the group of the oppressed. And we've seen pushback with that woman who identified as Black, but she was white. Obviously, we have lines in the grass that they're not crossing. But when it comes to being gay, the addition of queer has been just completely devastating because now when you go into a gay space, most people there are actually gay. I feel like to an extent, yes, the early 2000s and previous to, you had to face very blatant and legal homophobia and oppression, but at least you had a community. Now you go into I think ours was called Rainbow or something. You go into these clubs and it's a bunch of straight girls who identify as non-binary and therefore think that their boyfriends are inherently queer. You see a bunch of men identifying as women who will target you for saying, no, I only like natal women, actual women. No matter how you cushion the words, no matter how nice you say it, you're not allowed to have boundaries there. And I just feel like in general, the pushback we're seeing is mostly for the queer part. The people who identify as queer who want to lump in everything as weird. They want to lump in the BDSM. They want to lump in asexual people. They want to lump in anybody who feels different or othered, which is a very broad group and we have nothing in common. And then as a result, gay activism has stalled. You see a rise in homophobia. And you're seeing basically just modern day conversion therapy rhetoric where you're supposed to somehow be attracted to pronouns and not to people. And I just wonder where we're going to go from here because yeah, we've gotten some legalized rights. I'm glad we have the right to marriage, formally enshrined in law, but you're still seeing homophobia from people on your everyday, day-to-day streets because they're pushing back against the weird and the strange, who they think is the same thing we are.
Yeah, I mean, I should be very clear. I am not L or B, so I don't want to pretend to speak for lesbians or bisexual women, but I just want to agree with you and say that, I was talking to a friend of mine who came out as a lesbian in 1979 in rural Texas. And what she tells me is that it was easier to come out as a lesbian in 1979 in rural Texas than it is to deal with the reality of same-sex attraction today because of all of this, because of all of what you're saying. And I've heard from a lot of younger women that it is very hard to be a lesbian because, first of all, there are men flooding lesbian dating apps and dating groups and, and claiming to be lesbians. And it's rape culture, it's rape culture all over again. And as you said, it's conversion therapy, but it's corrective rape, right? Like we used to say that, when we used to be able to say that it was wrong for a man to say to a lesbian, if you just try dick, I'm sorry, but if for a man to say, if you just try dick, you'll like it, right? We used to be able to say that was wrong. But now men are doing that all the time and it's being celebrated.
It's also interesting to me how this overlaps with the rise of Black Lives Matter with more racial awareness. And it seems like a lot of people, like particularly around my age, started identifying out of, being a woman or being a man or whatever, to be non-binary, to be in some sort of oppressed class, to kind of avoid having to come to terms with, the fact that they do have some sort of privilege. The fact that there is some behavior changes they have to make. And I feel like this is also a way to hide homophobia, because it's, instead of admitting, yeah, these statements are homophobic, it's, well, now that I'm queer, you can't criticize what I say. And particularly with so many white straight men identifying as women, and they're in charge of, they're in charge of so many tech companies. It's so weird to me how many of them are in tech. But they're flooding and they're taking over our spaces. And like Dylan, there are people who do not represent us are being allowed to speak for us. Dylan's able to speak on behalf of women and girls when he's a man. He's never had girlhood. Girlhood for him is just dressing up cute and following what they had on TV. It wasn't walking home from the library and getting catcalled at age 11. It wasn't being taught from like the age of 8 to not go into a bathroom alone because there might be a guy inside. They didn't have that same environment of fear that a woman is raised with. And the same thing goes for these trans-identified males who are flooding LGB spaces and going, it's homophobic for you to say no to me. It's transphobic for you to deny my advances. It just feels like we've become very self-centered. It's a very self-centered society where your personal decisions, your personal choices, your personal decree of identity overrides material reality.
Well, and probably worth noting, Dylan's obsession with tampons is really pretty disgusting.
Yeah, I've noticed I don't understand the weird obsession with periods when it comes to them, because trust me, pretty much every girl I know would happily give that up, because it's not fun. It's not affirming. It's the thing that happens once a month for 30, 40 years. And, there's a host of other medical issues that only affect women. Endometriosis, PCOS, all these things, they're not glamorized like, for some reason, having a period is, which is just the fact that he got mailed free tampons from Tampax. Why?
It's just bizarre. But I also did want to address your point about white men, straight white men in particular. Are you familiar with Clymer? His born first name was Charles, and he now goes by Charlotte.
I don't think so.
Okay, so this is a guy who used to work at the Human Rights Campaign, and he calls himself a lesbian, she, her pronouns, thank you very much. And he calls himself Charlotte, and he's a white guy, straight white guy, ex-military. And he used to be heavily criticized by feminists for being just an openly known misogynist. He was really disgusting and still is, but now he goes by Charlotte. So now we're not allowed to call out his misogyny because he's a woman. So, but the reason I'm sharing this is that I watched a forum one time online by the National Organization for Women. And the panel was one Black woman who's a lesbian, one Black woman who's bisexual, one Latino guy who's gay, and Clymer, who's a straight white man. And everyone just kept deferring to him over and over and over again. And I was watching this thinking, why do you keep deferring to the straight white guy? And it's because he's a trans woman, right? And so therefore he's the most oppressed, even though he's just a straight white guy.
I've talked about this topic so often that I have like the statistics memorized, but it's something like 350 trans murders, I think, in 2018, or something like that. And it's basically like 0.004% of trans women are murdered, but the femicide epidemic is completely ignored. Women are more likely to be murdered than trans women are. And trans women are more likely to commit sex crimes than men or women. But we don't want to talk about that, of course.
I mean, I don't really know who falls into the category of trans women. So when we talk about these statistics, trans women are more likely to commit a sex crime. To me, that just says that men are just as likely to commit a sex crime when they put on a dress as they are if they don't put on a dress, or actually sometimes more likely to commit a sex crime if they put on a dress. But to me, this is all just the same category of men committing sex crimes. And we know, as you, I'm sure, know, that the overwhelming majority of sex crimes are committed by men against women and children, whether they're boys or girls.
It's the exclusion of, autogynephilia. It's a paraphilia. I mean, there's, Blanchard's division, you have the homosexual males and then the straight ones. And there is a marked trend in men who have that paraphilia of autogynephilia to be more likely to commit crimes. It's the overlap with the paraphilia in the same way that one could argue that women who have been raped have a higher rate of PTSD. The two illnesses, or the events, go together. But it's very hard to find proof of sex-based oppression in modern studies because for example, I'm a psychology student, and when we did practice studies at school, we didn't have choose your sex, male or female. It was choose your gender. And so you would have male, female, trans man, trans female, genderqueer, non-binary, and that tells you literally nothing because you're letting people choose how they want to be perceived instead of just marking how they are.
Yeah, and it's happening in medical schools too, which is very distressing, right? Medical schools are teaching students that sex isn't real. And I just don't know how that's going to work. I don't know how you can have informed medicine if you're not allowed to know what sex a person is. Can I go complaining about, lower back pain and demand a prostate exam? That's insane, right? But are medical professionals going to start doing that kind of thing?
And then, of course, that overlooks the fact that medical misogyny is a still ongoing problem. You
Right.
have obstetric violence with women who are going in to have kids and are giving husband stitches against their will, are being treated just completely horribly by healthcare professionals. You have the fact that we live in a world made for men to the point where like seatbelts are made for a male body, not a female one, and you're more likely to get injured in a car crash. Or that if you have a male surgeon, you're more likely to have a bad outcome than a female surgeon. And just completely ignoring that sex is real, that it exists, it just continues to let those problems go unnoted and unfixed. It's like people don't, instead of admitting that we live in a world that needs work, they're choosing to paint over the wallpaper and pretend that it's not there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And one thing that really gets me is that when it comes to, debates, whenever they want to do, for example, YouTube video comparing trans activists to women, they never put radical feminists against trans women or people who believe in gender ideology. It's always conservatives versus liberals, and they position conservatives and rad fems as being the same thing, which is kind of frustrating because I mean, if you want to say your piece, CNN's not going to let you do that because you say that sex is a real thing. That's violence. Saying that that's a real thing is apparently violence. And the conservatives will allow you to speak, but we don't have long-term aligned goals. And I've seen some criticism of the need to align ourselves with conservatives to get sort of a stage. Do you think that it's inherently negative to have to work with someone who opposes us in such a way?
I actually think there are some benefits to using conservative platforms aside from the downsides, right? So there are definite downsides to that. Some benefits to using conservative media outlets are that conservatives need to know that radical feminists are out here. And some of the conservative media outlets that will publish radical feminists, I value because I appreciate getting that voice because it it dampens the conservatives' ability to say, where are the feminists? Right. So if our voices can get out there to conservatives, we can be like, here we are, we're right here. So I think that there's value in doing that. I also think that conservatives, even though they generally oppose gender identity ideology, they still really like gender. And even though they're not in alignment with the idea that a person can change sex, they still use the language. So you'll hear conservative lawmakers and conservative media, for that matter, use language like transgender athletes or transgender prisoners or things like that. Feminists, for the most part, won't do that. We just call men men. And so I think it's valuable to be able to instruct and model that for conservatives and encourage them to take up that language. I think that's useful. Now, there are obvious downsides to working with conservatives who don't have our long-term interests at heart. I'm not naive about that at all. I definitely understand that. And also, we're making progress. I really do think that we're making progress. And I'm much angrier at the leaders of my own party. Well, that's not true. I've been a registered Democrat since I was 18, except for a very brief period of time when I was in the Green Party. And I'm still a registered Democrat, despite my party's insistence on acting as though sex isn't real. So I'm very mad at my party. And, if conservatives will help me get the word out about that, then I'll take it. I would much rather sit down with Democrats. I live in Washington, D.C., as I mentioned. If I could go down the street and get a meeting with Nancy Pelosi and talk about this, do you think I would do that? Of course I would. But she's not going to take my meeting, nor will any of the other Democrats in Congress. So until that happens, I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing.
And I gotta admit, I mean, if it works, it works. At least people are talking about this. And I think it's important to have as many points of view on this topic as possible, because I don't like the idea that there's only these two extremes. You're either a horrible bigot who hates trans people on account of them being trans, and you're just a horrible misogynistic, horrible person, or you're a liberal and you're perfect in every way. Because that kind of dichotomy is, like the vilification of the cis white female. It's something that I see so often, especially with like figures like, J.K. Rowling. This is a woman who's donated so much money to charities that she lost billionaire status. And yet, because she's a woman who's speaking out about the fact that oppression is real, she's the worst person in the world. Never mind that there are men out there who actually commit the transphobic crimes. It's just either you agree with one side all the way or the other side. There is no middle ground anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, the vilification of J.K. Rowling is awful. And, it's ironic because a lot of times what our opponents will say is, well, instead of picking on trans women, why don't you go after the cis men who are committing all these acts of violence? But feminists have been critiquing male violence against women since forever, and we're going to keep doing it. It's not like feminists are suddenly okay with male violence against women just because we also see this other problem of men claiming to be women. So there's a lot of hypocrisy, I think, on that side.
It's something that's I wasn't in Cambodia for too long. I was there for about 2 months, but they don't have the gender ideology there at all. I met one person who I was friends with who was a Cambodian, and she knew one person who had also traveled to Australia and had picked up being non-binary while she was there. But besides that, there was no discussion over what is a woman, what is a man. There was no discussion over, dressing in a certain way. There's that culture of, for example, effeminate gay men. They're called lady boys there. And it's a pretty long-term staple of the culture of Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia. But they're still viewed as men. Any violence against them is marked as homophobic violence, not as misogyny. And meanwhile, women are still fighting for their own rights there. Like it's a developing country to the point where I faced I was stalked when I was living there. I had a guy try to follow me home. You see issues with a lot of white men coming over there and taking advantage of impoverished women. You see the sex trade being an issue. And so feminists in Cambodia are facing problems that are very obvious. They still exist in the US. It's just the gender stuff is so much flashier, and it's been disrupting how we discuss our own oppression to the extent that it's hard to talk around it. I would love to focus on something else, Like I'd love to focus more on sexual violence or, obstetric violence or something that, a lot of women face, but we can't do that when we can't even say that we're women anymore. We're menstruating people, birth givers. And it's something that's very Western privilege, to be able to pretend that we don't need feminism, that oppression isn't real anymore, when the world isn't just the West. There's a large swath of this world where no one's denying that sex is real, But here we are trying to debate what is a woman still. Never what is a man, though. Just what is a woman.
Yeah, it is so far really a very Western privileged thing, as you say. I do worry though, because this stuff has also captured the UN, and United Nations bodies and other bodies like USAID are starting to are starting to require developing countries to change their laws to acknowledge gender identity as a condition of receiving aid. So I worry that it's seeping into other parts of the world that have so far not been touched by it.
That's something that's interesting to me, is that we try to pretend that colonialism is over with, that we're all in this enlightened society. We like to pretend that we don't have the patriarchy or misogyny or racism or colonialism anymore, where we're so advanced, we're done with that. But you go to countries like Cambodia, you go to countries in Africa, and you can very obviously see how American, how Western, individuals have impacted that culture and that society. And it's it's frustrating, because when I was in Cambodia, something that really got on my nerves was pretty much any bar in the expat side of town was a lady bar. So you would have women there who were working, and you would go online into the expat Facebook groups, and men would be blatantly asking where to get the best prostitutes at. And it was so normalized that a lot of Americans didn't see it as an issue. It's her choice. It was her decision. Do you think that a woman who never learned how to read, who didn't have a chance to go to anything past grammar school, really would have chosen this job if she had any other options? It's just,
Oh,
especially with sex work, the changing of language to soften prostitution to sex work. That's a big one that really peeves me, because not only does it just hide the dirty reality of prostitution, of girls coming in, in the morning with bruises all over their faces. I remember one girl, we saw her pretty often, would come in one day and she just completely black and blue. That's not the reality that Western women doing OnlyFans or selling pictures are seeing. And yet they're the ones who are trying to control how we talk about those topics. And gender is obviously a part of that. These are gendered problems. Women face certain problems that men don't.
yeah, it's true. So I'm probably going to have to get going here pretty soon.
Well, that was pretty much all my questions anyway. But thank you so much for talking with me, because I know that scheduling was a hassle, and time zones and all that. But I was really looking forward to this. I'm really glad we got a chance to speak.
Yeah, no, right?
Yeah.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. We can't have too many of these discussions. We need to keep talking about it. So thank you so much for bringing me on.